Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of Agahi with Warisa Zainab. In this holy month of Muharram, we are going to discuss the trauma, the psychological aspects of the holy household that they endured and experienced, not just during the days that they spent in the holy land of Karbala, but also the impact of the sacrifice of Abu Abdullah on the surviving members of the family. We will also shed light on the resilience showed by the holy household after the tragedy of Karbala and how it impacted their mental health. Today, in our episode, we have Father Christopher Clohessy, who is joining us today. He holds a PhD in Classical Arabic and Islamic Studies. And for further introduction, I'll ask Father Christopher to introduce himself and also the amazing work that he has done in the field of academic.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. I decided some years ago that I would pursue an academic path of Islamic studies, but specifically Shi'i Islamic studies after I had done my master's degree. And so I decided at the beginning that I would propose as a doctoral thesis a Christian perspective on Al-Hussein, Al-Hussein's martyrdom, but also his virtues as seen through a Christian lens. But as I was studying the life of Al-Hussein, obviously I came across the important life, crucial life really of his mother, Lady Fatima. And I was a little shocked that there was so little written about her. There were some pamphlets and of course the primary Arabic sources, which many people wouldn't read anyway, but very little in academia. And so I decided to repropose a doctorate and to create and write the first academic biography of Lady Fatima in English, but based on Arabic sources. And I produced that book some years ago, and it was in those days the first. Now a number of people have written, thank heavens, about Lady Fatima. And hopefully many more will examine the multiple aspects of her life. And soon after I finished that book, I decided to tackle a second member of the Ahlulbayt, who I thought was somewhat neglected, although who is held in high esteem throughout the Shi'i world, and that's Lady Zainab. And so I began to work on Lady Zainab, although the primary sources for her, far fewer. And I was a bit panicky at the beginning that I'd taken on more than I could chew, because I struggled at the beginning to find the classical sources. But I found what I needed in the historians and in the books of Hadith, and so produced a book called Half of My Heart, which is a line taken from one of the laments sung by Lady Fatima, cried out really by Lady Fatima as she sees her brother's body lying on the ground.
How long did it take you to carry out the research and write the books?
It took me a good few years. The doctoral writing took 3 or 4 years. Lady Zainab took 2 to 3 years, and the third book took 2 years. So the third book, while I was researching the life of Lady Zainab, I was obviously reading many of the hadith about Karbala, and I was coming across incidents which greatly interested me, but weren't really part of her story, specifically the dreams that people had and the visions they had, and especially the encounters they had with Jibreel, the Prophet in particular, predicting the death of Al-Hussein. And I put these into a folder on my computer and vowed that I would write a book one day. So my third book is called Angels Hastening, which is a line from one of the chapters of Quran in English translation. And it's about these dreams, and specifically the conversation that the Prophet has in the home of Salama when he is visited by Jibreel, and little Al-Hussein interrupts the conversation by entering the room unexpectedly. It results in a whole lot of things. And the book deals also with the dreams of some of those who were involved in his killing, dreams of what punishment they're going to face. So it's a trinity of books. It's 3 books, and now I'm working on a life of Al-Abbas, although like Lady Zainab, very few sources, and it's going to be quite a long, hard struggle, I think.
And I think it was all worth it. In regards to your most recent publication, the one that you published this year, tell us something about that book. I mean, you mentioned how you were inspired by the fact that Lady Fatima is one of the most, holy figures in the history of Islam. And unfortunately, there isn't much literature out there to cover her story. Same case with Lady Zainab, that we don't come across a lot of information, especially about her childhood and when she was younger before she got married. Most of the literature that we do find is focused on the events um, after the event of Karbala. So, in regards to your most recent book, what does it cover?
So the most recent book is about dreams, and dreams interest me in a religious sense because in the Jewish scriptures, the what we call the Old Testament, there are a lot of important dreams, but especially we have the dreams of Joseph, Prophet
Yes.
Yusuf, who in the Holy Quran is also a great dreamer and more importantly, an interpreter of dreams. But in the Hebrew scriptures, there are lots of others. The Prophet Yaqub also has dreams of angels, and these ideas were taken up into the Christian scriptures in the annunciation by the angel Gabriel to Mary that she is going to give birth to Jesus. In the Christian scriptures, she has a vision of Gabriel, very much like the vision of Jibreel that
Yes.
Lady Maryam has in Surat Maryam, with almost parallel. And Jibreel comes from heaven, this faithful spirit, this Ruh Allahi, and to bring her this news. But I classified visions and dreams in the same way, that they're all supernatural encounters in some way, some while you're awake and some while you're asleep. And then I began to discover that lots of people before the birth of Al-Hussein, through his conception and birth, through his life and after Karbala, lots of people had dreams which predicted his martyrdom.
Yes.
So even before he was born, the very angels who came to console the prophet, to congratulate the prophet, also consoled him that this boy was going to be killed. And from that moment on, we have this series of encounters, either with Jibreel or just with dreams, and they are fully reflected both in the Sunni and the Shi'i texts, these dreams, predicting the event of Karbala, and then more especially the punishment upon the generation that betrayed him.
And dream interpretation is something which is not only significant in modern psychology, but also in most monotheistic faiths. So whether it's Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, dream interpretation is something that is looked at to predict certain future events. And like you gave brilliant examples that the event or the tragedy of Karbala was something that was preconceived through dreams by most of the holy households and their companions.
If I could just add there, the Prophet himself was very interested in people's dreams, and he told his ummah, if anyone had a dream last night, come and tell me and I will interpret it. And it was after his death, with the absence of this prophetic figure who was really the center point of the community, that some of the scholars began to think that perhaps dreams could give us guidance. And so early on in Islam, people like Ibn Sirin began to produce manuals of dream interpretations. And even in all the books of hadith, there's at least one book always on the interpretation of dreams. So it became a hugely important field. And I think it still is in Islam. I think people still are greatly interested in what dreams are telling us.
Even if you look at the prophetic traditions in the pre-Islamic era, you look at Prophet Yusuf, for example, that people used to ask him and come to him and ask for dream interpretation. So this is something which has always been of significance.
And of course, taken up by the modern psychologists like Jung, who thought that dream interpretation was very important. So it's not just a bit of religion, it really is a serious psychological pursuit.
Yes. There is a lot of emphasis on mourning, on lamentation, on remembering the sacrifice of Imam Hussein and to learn important, valuable lessons from that sacrifice. But there is one area where I feel that people often neglect is the fact that they were also human beings. They experienced pain, sadness, grief, bereavement. They had emotional attachments with their children, with their family members. It's not just because they were infallible, so they were immune to pain. And we see this over and over that throughout the events that took place in the short span of time, the conversations that took place between Imam Hussein and his companions, his family members, even before they started the journey, you can see that they were, in the end of the day, human beings. although when it comes to submission to Allah, he was at the highest level of, as you call it, nafs mutma'inna. But I would like you to shed some light on the psychological trauma that they experienced. Um, Although, yes, they showed resilience, but at the same time, it did have an impact on their body and their mind.
I would begin with the imams themselves, who share in this quality of isma. And isma does not reduce one's humanity. Isma does not make the imam less human. It reshapes and remolds all kinds of things within him, but the imam is still human. We know this because all of the imams were martyred. You can't be martyred, and suffer physical death if you're not fully human. We also know that from the Prophet onwards, people experienced grief. The Prophet himself experienced grief at the death of his daughter, for example, at the death of members of his family.
Yes.
And he showed his grief unashamedly, because grief is an important part of dealing with our trauma. And from him, through Ali and Lady Fatima, through their sons, and through all of the others, both those who, if you'd like to say, are first level members of the community who are ma'soom, and then the secondary members like Lady Zainab, all of them are human. And one of the reasons I wrote the book about Lady Zainab particularly was because my reading around her life suggested that people either saw her as a superhero,
Yeah.
or they saw her as a weeping, crying woman, but not a combination of the two, as though the two were not compatible. The truth about Lady Zainab was she was an exceptionally powerful woman in her speaking and in her remembrance and in her recounting. She was an exceptionally powerful woman in facing two of the most terrible men of her day, that is Ibn Ziyad and Yazid. But she also shows quite clearly her fear, her emotion, her anxiety, especially in the days before Karbala. If we read the text seriously, they tell us of Lady Zainab having to be comforted by her nephew Zain al-Abidin, because she is so distraught by some of the things happening. And I attempted with her to find a balance, that this weeping woman was also powerful when she needed to be, that it's not forced. She's not suppressing her grief, because to suppress anything psychologically is a very dangerous thing to do.
Yes.
She doesn't suppress her grief. We don't live without grief. We live with our grief and still continue to believe that God's providence is with us. And she is, for me, a perfect model of this. So I think it's very important that, starting with the Prophet himself, and going right through the line of imams, but also through the other members of the Ahlulbayt, we have to remember their humanity, because if we don't, then they are no longer models for our lives, yours and mine, who are just beings faced with trauma each day. What can Lady Fatima say to me if she is a level above me in her humanity and I can never reach that level?
And it wasn't just psychological pain that they experienced. I think they were tested to their maximum limits, with deprivation of food, deprivation of sleep, to be surrounded in a hostile environment where people physically attack them. They were chained, they were dragged from one place to another. So there was physical exhaustion, there was mental trauma. And despite all of this, we see that she did not miss her prayers. She still had hope. And for her to say that when she was standing in the court of Yazid, and he said what he did, and she, in response to that, she said, "I saw nothing but beauty." That statement is so powerful in itself. And we, as normal, ordinary human beings, fail to understand that how can a woman who has watched her brother being mercilessly butchered from like 40 steps, 70 steps away, she's still standing with confidence, with her head held high, and saying, she's showing gratitude to her creator instead of complaining, what I think most of us would have done.
Yes.
That really
I think
raises.
there's an interesting progression, because if we were to picture that group that journeyed towards Karbala, that is Al-Hussein, the women and children with him, his own son, particularly his own sons, actually, plural, and then the other members. As we watch the progression towards Karbala, most of their torment is psychological. I mean, nobody goes into death without fear. Nobody. all humans share a fear of death and what it's going to bring, in the moments after death. No matter how close we are to God, we are still human beings. So there would have been the psychological trauma. But when the enemy army discovered that the psychological trauma was not enough to stop them, they had to apply a second level of suffering, and that was deprivation of water, especially more than food. The water is the crucial issue. Deprivation of water. And then thirdly, even in battle, threats to burn down the tents of the women and to kill them, which is, you've got a group of women who are watching their members, family members being killed, not as an army, but one by one as they go out to face the enemy. And having watched this, then they are threatened with being burnt to death in their own tents. And then, of course, at the end of all this, Lady Zainab has to gather the survivors and be a mother to them, these women and children. And she does that. She becomes the matriarch of the Ahlulbayt for a few days until her nephew is physically strong enough to then take up his appointed role. But for those few days, especially in the streets of Kufa, then before Ibn Ziyad, then before Yazid, she is the spokesperson and the matriarch, despite her trauma, which is real trauma. She doesn't suppress it. She learns how to cope with it and to deal with it. And this is very important.
To have that kind of strong, positive mindset and to maintain that during that calamity that that fell upon the holy household and their companions, and at the same time you're experiencing grief, bereavement, physical and psychological pain, and at the same time you also have the responsibility of leadership and to safeguard the imama, to manage the leadership role and also to control your emotions, because surely she wanted to cry for her loved ones, but her focus was on something which was far bigger than that, to look after and safeguard the children, the vulnerable women, and Ali ibn al-Hussein, who was unwell at the time and weak. For a woman who has never stepped outside her house by herself before, who has never been on a journey like this before, this is her first time, first experience. And she managed to do all of that with such resilience. Do you think faith plays a vital role here?
Oh, I think it's crucial. The problem for me is I think that if you look at a person like Lady Fatima al-Hussein, their faith is at a higher level than most people. I mean, besides saying, I see nothing but beauty, when she is preaching these, they weren't really, it wasn't a khutbah, it was really an ihtijaj, it was a protest in the streets of Kufa. But when she's mockingly questioned by Ibn Ziyad, she says they have gone to the place where they were foreordained to go. So her faith includes this understanding of God, that something is written by God. It's foreordained by God. And that part of faith means I believe this and I accept this, that it was part of God's plan. Most of us kick furiously against suffering without being willing to accept that maybe this is part of God's plan for me. Maybe this is his way of getting my attention or teaching me a lesson. We just rage against suffering. But Lady Zainab understands that all of this is foreordained. So her faith, she's carried by faith as though on wings. It holds her. There's a very interesting psychological point of this, that is that if you read the nights, the days and the nights just before Karbala, I would say probably 5, 6, 7, 8 of Muharram, 9 of Muharram, Lady Zainab has a number of traumatic incidents where she hears laments or she hears the approaching army and she takes fright. She's disturbed by what she hears. She says to her brother, I can hear them, they're coming. Yeah. But on the day of the battle, 3 times, this woman emerges from her tent, not to the sidelines, but to the middle of the battlefield. The first time to weep over Ali al-Akbar, who had been killed. The second time to try and stop her little nephew from going to fight, who's so tiny, he can barely carry a sword, and she fails. And then the third time, she actually goes out in the presence of people like Shimr and Sinan and Saad, Umar bin Saad, and she challenges the authenticity of their Islam. is there not a Muslim among you? The texts say when she walked out of her tent on the day of Karbala, she was like the sun rising. That's an extraordinary psychological note for me. And I spent a great deal of time talking about this overnight transformation, that the day of Karbala, Zaynab became the person God intended her to be and do the job he intended her from the beginning to do.
And when you talk about Lady Zainab being brave and courageous in the face of calamities and trials and tests that were, that life threw towards her, we see that she did not become resilient overnight, but this was something that she was accustomed to when it comes to injustices and oppression, because even as a child, she witnessed the most horrific brutalities that any child, no child deserves to see when her brother Hassan's body was attacked when they were taking him for burial towards her grandfather's grave. To witness that, that was shocking enough. And then as a child, she witnessed the atrocities that took place at her house's door, where her mother was physically attacked and the door was burned down. So if you even look at her childhood, I think even her childhood was pretty traumatic.
Yeah.
That must have definitely taken its toll as well to make her.
She would have had a series of trauma, starting with the death of her grandfather, the Prophet of Islam, because she was in and around his house. She was there, and so she would have known him, and he would have been a figure in her life. And then the murder of her father, Ali, which was horrendous. And then just before the murder of her father, she was present at the house when the door was beaten down and her mother was gravely injured. She would have seen and heard the abuse heaped on the Ahlulbayt as a young child.
Yes.
Then the murder of her brother Hassan, then the journey to Karbala. So it was a series in her life, starting from childhood, of traumatic events. And yet she strikes you as this balanced, sympathetic, empathetic, compassionate human being. She's an enormously attractive person, Lady Zainab. She's the sort of person you want in your family, the person you can turn to, because she has a wisdom, a collective wisdom, and an empathy about her that not everybody has, despite the trauma.
Yes. And this is just one example that we have. If you look at the female members of the holy households, and even if you look at the lives of other prophets before Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, Lady Maryam, she was the daughter of a prophet, and her son, according to Islamic beliefs, was a messenger of God. And if you look at her life, it was full of challenges. It wasn't an easy, smooth journey. The things that she had to endure in her life, and character assassination was another thing that people used against her, despite the fact that she was righteous and pious. But it seems like the female members of the holy prophets or holy figures, they have always been subjected to trials, tribulations, tests, challenges, and they still manage to find purpose in pain. And I think this is the biggest lesson we learn from all these tragic events. So if we focus on the events that took place post Ashura, and we hear of this a narration where Lady Zainab's hair turned white overnight. Now, if you look at medical history, or there have been some cases where people's hair turned white overnight because of the grief and the stress they went through, and what the body's like the impact of the psychological pain on the body with the release of certain hormones that does that. So we have examples where we can say that, yes, like you said, they were humans.
I'd go as far as suggesting that Lady Zainab was a martyr of Karbala, because she only lived for a year or so in a fair amount of obscurity wherever she lived. Some people say Egypt, some people say Damascus. It's a disputed point, but wherever she lived, she certainly held these majalis of sorts. She certainly recounted over and over the events and kept the memory alive. But we know very little of her life in that last year, and I suspect that in one sense, part of her had died on that battlefield, that she was a martyr just as surely as all the others were, and that she calls the Prophet, she calls her brother half of my heart. Half of her heart died at Karbala. And the last year of her life must have been one of such grief and sadness, because it's impossible to suppress bad memories, memories of violence done against people. It's impossible, no matter how close one is to God. We are, again, human beings, and we have imaginations and intellect. We cannot suppress these things. And I can't imagine, despite being surrounded by people she loved and knew, what that last year of her life must have been, because she had to keep recounting the story. And every time she recounted it, it would just start all over again in her own mind and heart. And as you quite rightly say, she's one of numerous women of the Ahlulbayt. I think of the young girls imprisoned in Damascus.
Yes.
Who there's some very good stuff written about them, who not only were imprisoned, but first were exposed to this terrible vision in the court of Ibn Ziyad of the heads of the martyrs. At least Yazid, the one thing he did, according to some of the Maqatil literature, is he tried to shield the children from the sight of Al-Hussein's head. Ibn Ziyad made no such effort. He was a dreadful man. Can you imagine exposing little 4, 5, 6-year-olds to that and then putting them in a dungeon? It is beyond our comprehension. And yet they,
Yeah. And the unfortunate thing is that this tradition of brutality still continues in present day. When you look at countries like Iraq and Syria and what the civilians are being subjected to by the tyrants of this time, it's like Karbala is repeating itself. We've spoken about Lady Zainab, and we also touched upon the tragedies that fell on Lady Fatima Zahra Salamullah alayha. Now, when we look at the children and you see that they were deprived of water and they were crying, but at the same time, they were also patient. And for a child to show such level of maturity and sensibility, that's another example of how amazing their upbringing was. So instead of Lady Sukaina or Lady Ruqayya asking their father to go and get water from the river, they understand the situation and they choose to remain quiet and patient. And for a child to do that,
well, this of course only serves further to highlight Al-Abbas, because he did something he didn't actually have to do. I mean, he did it freely and willingly and determinedly. He gave up his own rights, the right to live, for the rights of these children. That is enormous. When you meet human beings who are willing to forego their own rights, because everyone today screams about my rights, these are my rights, my rights, everybody's got rights. And there you have Abbas, who gives up his own rights for the sake of a group of children who are thirsty. He must have been an extraordinary comfort for those children. I think he was a very big man. His legs used to drag on the ground when he sat on a horse. So he was a gentle giant, if you like. And I suspect that his presence and his attempt to get water for those children must have been a source of great comfort for them and only helped them to endure a little further. But, again, when we look at the way children suffer today in war zones, when we look at, children being bombed and losing their parents, and it is horrendous. To try to understand what sort of effect that is going to have in the future for children. It is beyond comprehension, like so many other things in our world.
Yes. And these children...
And the violence against women is not just physical, there's also what I call velvet violence. And velvet violence doesn't leave any scars or bruises. It's verbal abuse, or it's removing their rights or their freedoms, or making them feel less than fully human, or expressing disappointment in them. When a man, and I know that in some cultures this is done, but when a man expresses sadness that his baby is a girl and not a boy, that must inflict terrible grief on the mother. But it's also a terrible insult in a way to females. Why would any person not welcome a child into the world? And I think women suffer all kinds of violences that are not physically necessarily, but are as scarring and as damaging.
Of course, coercive control and neglect, discrimination, psychological manipulation, all these things exist. And like you said, they may not leave physical scars or wounds, but they are far deeper than the physical scars and wounds that people endure as a result of physical attack or abuse. And in regards to the children living in war zones or conflict regions, the thing that they witness, it robs them of their childhood, their innocence. And after going through a traumatic childhood, when they grow up as adults, they show signs of post traumatic stress disorder or complex PTSD, and then their quality of life is affected. And I think this is the most normal response to when you experience like death or torture or conflict. But when you look at Ali ibn al Hussein alayhi salam, he was unwell. He was physically not in the position to fight in the battlefield. And I think maybe this was a way to protect him, to save him. As an imam, maybe this was part of the divine plan. We don't know. But we see that after the event of Ashura, when they do return back to their homes, we find numerous traditions where it says that anything would trigger the memory, the horrific memory of the day of Ashura. For example, the butchers would cover their, meat products every time they realized that Ali ibn Hussein is passing by because they knew exactly what's going to happen. Similarly, when water was placed before him to do ablution, he would cry so much that the water would not be fit for consumption. So, and you hear about so many other traditions. So this just proves that although he was an imam, although he was granted the position of leadership, divine leadership, but in the end of the day, he was human.
If I could reflect for a moment on his character as a Christian theologian, because I think for me, as a non-Muslim, I think every single member of the Ahlulbayt has a particular virtue. So, Al-Hussein has the virtue of determination to stand for what is just and to fight for it. Lady Zainab has this courage, because courage isn't a male virtue, it's a human virtue. She has this courage and this ability to articulate the truth. I think the primary virtue in the life of Ali bin al-Hussein is genuine holiness. He was genuinely, truly holy, but in a way that it would stop you in your tracks. The sort of holiness that would make the world look up for a moment from all its fighting to ask, who is this person? So, he was at Karbala and he wasn't too young to fight. There were much younger men fighting than him, but he was certainly sick, but it was a providential sickness because it was the imama being preserved, I think, theologically, it was the imama being preserved. There's a particular moment where he steps in and takes over as the spokesperson for the Ahlulbayt. He says to his aunt, be quiet now, let me speak. And she begins to fade beautifully and humbly into the background as the imamate begins to shine in Ali bin al-Hussein. And when he's standing before Yazid, he quotes Holy Quran at him, and Yazid's son is unable to quote Quran back, which is a very good moment. And Yazid becomes somewhat fascinated by him. Maybe he saw this holiness. Maybe he did. When he returns to Medina, two things go on in his life. The one is, besides the imama, besides that, the one is, as you've mentioned, the prayer and the grief. We'll talk about that now. The other thing was acts of charity. Yes. Like his grandfather, Ali, he was well known for taking food to the poor, sacks of food to people's houses. They didn't know it was him only when he died. So in between the piety, the remembrance, the makatil, not the makatil, the majalis, in between all of that, there's also action for justice for the poor.
Yes.
I also think that I agree with you. I think he must have been hugely traumatized by what he saw. And we know that survivors suffer a particular form of trauma, a guilt that they survived and others didn't. But I also think in his case, part of his weeping is what we would call, from the theological point of view, the gift of tears given by God.
Yes.
That wasn't necessarily always a result of trauma, but also a gift from God. The gift to weep over the martyrs is a beautiful thing. So he's a perfect model again for people who've been through really bad things, that life doesn't end, doesn't have to end. That, as you know, and I think that it would be much more difficult if people have no faith in God. People who live without God, not sure how they do it, but for people who have faith in God, there's a moment to reconnect to God through one's prayers, through one's fasting, through one's pious actions, and realize that God is bigger than our trauma, and that our faith is bigger than our trauma. It doesn't collapse. It's not a house of cards. And I think that he is a perfect model of that faith can carry you.
And the beautiful, heart-touching supplications that he taught us. There's a whole collection of his supplications in the form of a book, the Psalms of Islam. Each and every single one of them, the selection of words, the way he communicates with his Lord, with his Creator, the humbleness, the piety, the righteousness, it teaches people like us how to ask God to fulfill our needs. So you come across supplications when in fear, when feeling anxious, when feeling stressed or worried. These are all basic, normal human emotions that we feel or come across in our everyday life. I don't think there's any human being on the planet who does not experience stress, fear, or anxiety at some point in their lives. But for someone to teach us how to supplicate in these difficult and challenging times, that's a beautiful gift, a legacy that he has left behind.
So I think that many Muslims, many Shia Muslims don't realize the treasure they have in the Sahifa. And in Rome, where I teach, when I teach the Shi'i course in theology, I always tell my students that I expect each of them, and most of my students are not Muslims, I tell them I expect each of you to have a copy of the Sahifa on your bedside table and to use it and to read it often, because it is not only beautiful Arabic, but it is more especially beautiful prayer, and especially that last section of the whispered prayers, which are just, it's the earliest prayer book in Islam. There is no prayer book that is earlier than the Sahifa. Therefore, we owe a great debt to Zain al-Abidin for that gift, for his supplications. And that's why I said, I think holiness, these are the prayers that he prayed. This man was truly holy. And that's for me his great model, that despite all of his pain, he was close to God. He was a man of God.
One of the things that are taught by mental health professionals and psychologists and psychotherapists for people experiencing high levels of anxiety or psychological pain or trauma or stress is meditation. To focus on their breathing and to calm the mind. And we see that Ali ibn al-Hussein alayhi salam is known for prostrations, like really long and lengthy prostrations. Now, if you look at the research that has been carried out on the effects or the benefits of prostration on the human body and the human mind, it has a very calming and therapeutic effect. So, this is my belief that every single imam, every single divine leader that we have been blessed with has taught us something. And like you said, everybody was gifted with one of the quality or a virtue. And for example, Ali ibn Hussein is known for his piety and his patience and humbleness. And one of the amazing works that we have today in the form of a book is the Divine Treatise on Rights. And that book is just absolutely amazing. Things that we take for granted, things that we don't even pay attention to. And he has described that they have rights over us and rights over others.
I think that in one sense, in terms of the history of Shi'i Islam, you have this series of imams. So you have Ali al-Hassan al-Hussein, who are the great martyrs, although Ali is also a supremely wise teacher, but martyrdom is features strongly. But then you have the series of Zain al-Abidin, and then al-Baqir, and then Ja'far as-Sadiq, who are the great and profound men of theology and men of God, who have offered us so much literature, so much theology, so much understanding, that in the space of these three imamates, these three men, you have the most important theology being constructed and written, and the most important spirituality. So certainly Zain al-Abidin gives us these two texts, in fact three, because the whispered prayers are probably a separate text that were later joined, and then the treatise on rights. But look at Ali with his Naj al-Balagha, this extraordinary work of Ali as well as all of his prayers. So the wealth of literature for people. Meditation has long been a practice in Christianity, but one has to be careful because there are different types of meditation.
Of course.
Some of them don't always lead to God. But I always said to people that when I was studying Arabic in Cairo, I used to go and sit in one of the masjids, mostly because it was cool in the heat of the day. But to sit in a place of worship that's empty, a mosque or a church or a synagogue or a temple, to sit there for a while if you can when it's empty is an extraordinary experience, because of course it's not empty. God is always present, but empty of people is an extraordinary experience and can only benefit. Silence benefits mental health. Silence is the great healer. It truly is. And the more we can find silence, switch off all our connectivity and all our loud noise, and just find silence, the more we're going to find that healing that we need, because not a single one of us is undamaged. Life damages everybody. And some of us carry it better than others, but I know lots of people who find life difficult to negotiate. And it's for people like that healing is desperate. And I think silence in a house of God, not necessarily praying, simply sitting in silence in a house of God is a marvelous healer.
And this is another trend that we often see in the lives of these holy figures, that they used to spend a certain amount of time on a regular basis in solitude, to contemplate, to reflect upon things. And again, in modern psychology, this is something which is highly recommended, to find inner peace, to find contentment when you've got chaos within your mind. So all the challenges that they experienced in their lives, which they did. So we can't say that they had easy lives, or just because they had a certain level of authority or power, they were exempted from these trials. No, they weren't. In fact, they experienced it more than we did. But still, they have showed us through these examples that when we come across something similar in our life, what attitude we should have, and instead of reacting to an event, how we should respond to it.
Yeah, I think that at the heart of the whole event of Karbala, Karbala, I've always understood Karbala as an ongoing event in which people live today. It's not a historical battle, but Karbala is the place where we live if we choose to stand for justice. And I think that almost each one of us has a little tell the truth, or I have to make an unpopular decision and I know people will be angry. Each of us faces a Karbala moment, maybe not on a grand level, but on a small level. So the way to deal with Karbala now is I want to learn from it, from the examples of the martyrs. I want to be able to mourn for them and be grief-stricken, but there must be a third element, and that is to take action of some sort. And again, action for justice would include caring for the mental health of someone in your family who's struggling to negotiate life, or taking time to sit and talk to an elderly person who's all alone and cut off from society, or spending time with a child who's been traumatized by some loss of a loved one. These are wonderful ways to imitate not only the Karbala event, the Hussein model, but also the model of Zain al-Abidin, who was able to break from his prayer to take food to the poor. Very important.
Yes, and I think if we analyze the entire event that took place in Karbala, there are so many lessons that can be learned. And for me, for example, because I was born in a Muslim family, and since my childhood, I have been listening to the maqatil, the musiba of Abu Abdullah Hussein. Every time we hear the same story, but every time it has a different kind of impact and effect on the mind. And even to this day, it's like, I find it really difficult. I find like I'm unable to comprehend. Surely there is more to the story. There are things that we are not aware of. And according to our traditions, we are not fully aware of all the events that took place on the 10th of Muharram. There is more to that.
Much of it known only to the Imam, but nonetheless, as one hears the story, little details come out and become quite important. And one of the joys of writing my last two books was some of the tiny details that moved me. For example, an eyewitness account of a little boy going out to fight and his sandal strap was broken. And I thought that is a beautiful moment captured by an eyewitness, that he was so small that even his sandal strap had fallen and he couldn't fix it, but he was going out to fight for his uncle. These, and Lady Zainab's earrings shining in the sun as she walked across the battlefield. For me, these little eyewitness events, I learn new ones all the time as I read the Maqatil literature, and they're moving because these are human beings who have decided to take a stand for justice and pay the ultimate price for that stand. Very few people are willing to go all that.
Not just justice, but also the selflessness and the attitude of forgiveness and that they portrayed. For example, we know that Hur was responsible for a lot of things. The fact that they had to stay in Karbala and they were not allowed to progress further where they were supposed to go, he was like part of that plan to prevent them from going to Kufa. But for Imam Hussein to forgive him and embrace him with open arms, if I put myself in that position, I don't think I'll be able to forgive somebody who has done such great injustice, not just to me, but my loved ones, my friends, my family. But again, this is another lesson that we learn.
I'm very lucky because I come from South Africa, and we had Nelson Mandela, who came out of prison after 20 or more years, unjustly condemned to prison, and he came out without any anger, simply forgiving everybody. And he was a marvelous moment of what human beings, the heights that human beings can reach, to hold no grudges against anybody after having, most of your life stolen from you, was an extraordinary. But those people are rare. They raised up a few of them in every generation, and we must watch out for them because they are the ones we should attach ourselves to in some way and learn from. So I think that all of the members of the Ahlulbayt, I mean, all of them are killed, all of them are martyred, all of them are profoundly immersed in forgiveness of those who have harmed them. You don't hear angry condemnations, and you don't hear that from the mouths of the imams. And so they carry all of them in that each generation carries this ability to embrace the world, even if the world is vicious and angry, and to hold it close.
And you don't hear words of regret either. Although there is a lot of discussion around, oh, he shouldn't have gone to Karbala in the first place. He shouldn't have responded to the letters that were written to him. But then their ultimate purpose in life was submission to the Creator. Everything else was secondary. And although they were aware of what's going to happen, they still proceeded with that journey because martyrdom is something which is considered as part of imamat. So they didn't have any fear of dying or leaving the world or sacrificing their children. But the thing that pains them most, especially Ali ibn Hussein alayhi salam, is the fact that the female members of his family, of his household, and children were subjected to torture. They were deprived of their head coverings. Their faces were revealed, something that they used to, because the concept of hijab actually started from this family. And this was something which was very dear to them. And we see in today's world, in some parts of the world where they imposed a ban on certain kind of dressing, which is against, like you said, it's against human rights. So we see the violation of human rights in the city of Damascus, when they were chained and they were deprived of their clothing, just to humiliate them. So that's again another form of mental torture that they had to endure.
Oh, look, it's quite clear that we're living in a generation, especially in the West, where there's every attempt to stamp out religion, the mention of God in any public place. It is not even subtle, it is quite clear. And I know this as a church member, how it's becoming increasingly difficult to do the things we used to do, because they're all, you're not allowed to mention God on television, you're not allowed to, to show forth your religious, and if you do, you get insulted publicly. So, we are living in a time of psychological martyrdom where we have to suffer simply for having faith in God. It might not be our lives we lose, but people try to take our dignity, they try to take our sense of calm, and this does damage people. It's hard to be faithful if you're constantly abused, and if the world around you is constantly telling you how backward you are. One has to just keep faith in God and take people like Abbas, like Zainal Abidin as models, and say, well, these people clung on and through far worse than I have to go through. Nobody's threatened to take my life, you know. We have to take these people as modern day models, even if their death was 1400 years ago. It doesn't matter. They are modern day models of persecution for faith in God and for faith in God's law.
Definitely. If we talk about your personal experience, you must have spent so many hours of study, research. I mean, I don't know if you have lost count of the number of days or weeks or months or years that you have spent in researching, gathering information. And I believe you have not just confined yourself to Shi'i narrations, but you have also gathered information from other sects and schools of thought. If I ask you, out of all the personalities that you have researched and studied, if I could ask you which one inspires you most? I know it's a difficult question, but...
Without doubt, Lady Zainab. I mean, without doubt. Although I have to say now, I'm becoming increasingly more fond and more devoted to Al-Abbas as I study his life, because he is certainly an interesting character. But Lady Zainab, without doubt, captured my attention. So did Lady Fatima, so do they all, so does Ali, of course. And I ashamedly don't know as much about Ali as I know about the others. He's not one that I studied profoundly, and I've admitted this before that I'm lacking. But Lady Zainab, for me, from the beginning, was the one who held my attention, because I thought, well, she's sort of my age. She was sort of my age, Karbala. So I understand what it is to be this age and to have to go through trauma, and how I would do anything to avoid going through trauma at my age. And yet she embraced it willingly. But she also strikes me, firstly, as a grandmotherly figure, sort of aunt or grandmother you would like in your household, because you could take refuge with her and learn from her. She also, for me, thirdly, represents the elderly, because we forget that the elderly have things to offer, wisdom to offer. And we've exiled our elderly because they can't keep up with our technology. Often we're so connected with everybody except the people in the room with us. And many of those people are the elderly who are unable to keep us up. And so they live in a form of exile. And I think that Lady Zainab is a reminder that in every age, people have something to offer and a wisdom to learn from. If only we would not only respect our elderly, but be prepared to take time to learn from them, because she was not a young woman at Karbala, and yet look what she did in terms of remembrance and saving her nephew's life and condemning wickedness. So I think that this, for me, makes her an outstanding personality. But of course, I began with Lady Fatima, and Lady Fatima holds a special place in my life and always will, and I will surely eventually write more about her as well.
We can't wait to read more about her either. I would highly recommend people who are watching this program right now to read the books that Christopher has written after years of research and hard work, and in every page, every word is worth it. Thank you so much, Christopher, for joining us today, for sharing this beautiful insight into the research that you have carried out. And any last message you would like to give to the viewers?
Just to wish all of my friends now in these days of Muharram as they approach, and I know they become more and more emotional, more and more intense as the days go by, and I think that's a very important emotion and a very important tension in our lives, climaxing, of course, in Ashura, but just to wish them well in these days, that their grief and their suffering is an important feature of life. Our faith is not a dry legalistic thing. It's a passionate love for God and for his law. And these rituals that many other people may not understand are a way of expressing in action what our words can no longer express. So I pray that for everybody who in these days is going to be remembering the days leading to Karbala and then the event itself, that they will be days of blessing and serenity and joy for you in the midst of all of the sadness and the grief.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. For all the viewers watching us, inshallah, we'll join you next Saturday with another guest and topic related to your psychological well-being and spirituality. Till then, look after yourselves and most importantly, your mental health. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.